It's 1:55 a.m. on April 1st, 2006. A security camera mounted above the escalator at the Gateway in Columbus, Ohio, captures a moment that will become one of the most replayed, dissected, and haunting pieces of surveillance footage in modern true crime. A young man stands just inside the entrance of a bar called the Ugly Tuna Saloon. He's smiling, laughing, talking with the two women he just met minutes earlier. His name is Brian Shaffer, a 27-year-old medical student at Ohio State University. He leans in gently as the conversation continues, and he looks relaxed. His hands move as he talks, the universal body language of someone telling a story. The women say goodbye, he waves, and then he steps back into the bar. And this is the moment the world can't look away from. Brian Shaffer walks into the Ugly Tuna Saloon and is never seen again. Not by his friends, not by his family, not by police, not by any other camera in the building, not in the streets outside, not anywhere. It's as if he's walking into a doorway that leads out of this world. And this right here, the moment he steps inside, is the last confirmed sighting of him ever. A man disappears in a building covered in surveillance cameras on a busy campus in the heart of a major American city. This is not folklore. This is not urban myth. This is not embellishment or sensationalism. This is real. This happened. And nearly 20 years later, nobody can explain how. I'm Mr. Bones, and this is the Night Tale Show. Tonight, we step into one of the most unnerving vanishings in true crime history. So, where do you begin when a man disappears into thin air? Not metaphorically, not emotionally, not symbolically. Literally. Brian's case is not like other disappearances. Most missing persons leave behind something: a trail, a fight, a witness, a phone, a last conversation that contains worry or tension, something. But Brian leaves behind nothing. He leaves behind a jacket, a life, a girlfriend, a family who adored him, but no trace, no clue, no logic, no pathway to follow. In a sense, his entire case is a puzzle missing all of its corner pieces. You don't know what the picture is supposed to look like. To tell this story properly, we have to go back before the cameras, before the bar, before the drinks, before the laughter captured on grainy video. We have to understand Brian himself, because without him, the mystery is just noise. Brian Shaffer was born on February 25th, 1979. He grew up in Pickerington, Ohio, a suburb east of Columbus. He was bright, charismatic, likable, in the effortless way certain people are. A musician, a thinker, a man with the laid-back energy of someone who could walk into a room and ease everyone else's energy just by being there. He loved Jimmy Buffett, not just the music, but the lifestyle behind it. And in another universe, Brian would have been living on a beach somewhere, guitar in hand, beard beside him, no schedule to keep, but life doesn't always follow the fantasy. His mother, Renee, was the emotional center of the Shaffer family, warm, gentle, and supportive. And in 2006, Brian had just started his second year of medical school, not because he wanted the salary or the prestige, but because he genuinely wanted to help others. His professors remembered him as the kind of student who stayed behind to help classmates study. He had a serious girlfriend, Alexis Wagner, another medical student, and they were planning a spring break trip to Miami that coming Monday. Brian's friends claimed he was considering proposing soon, and Alexis said that she knew without question that Brian was her person. He was the man she expected to marry. But a storm was brewing under the surface, one that nobody fully understood at the time. And Brian's mother had recently passed away after a long, devastating battle with cancer in March of 2006. This was 3 weeks before he disappeared. The loss broke something open in Brian. Friends described him as distracted, quieter, not quite himself, and he loved his mother deeply, and losing her shook his world. Grief has a way of rearranging your internal map, moving all the familiar landmarks, making the world feel slightly off axis, and sometimes when you're grieving, you hide that rearrangement from everyone around you, even the people who love you most. Was Brian hiding something? Was he hurting more than anyone realized? Was he planning something nobody saw coming? Or did someone take advantage of his vulnerability? These questions linger like smoke around every part of this case. March 31st, 2006, the last day of classes before Ohio State spring break. The weather is warm, campus is buzzing, and it's a Friday night in Columbus. The arena district is alive with students, laughter spilling onto the sidewalks, and neon signs glowing over crowds. Brian's friend, Clint Florence, convinces him to go out for drinks. Clint later says he thought Brian needed a break, something to clear his mind, and Brian agrees. So around 9 p.m., the two head to the Ugly Tuna Saloon, a second-floor bar, accessible only by an escalator from the street below. The bar is loud, packed with students. There's live music and the usual pulsing energy of a weekend crowd. Brian and Clint bar hop for a few hours, meeting up later with Clint's friend Meredith Reed, who gives them a ride back to the Ugly Tuna Saloon shortly before 2 in the morning. This is when Brian appears on the famous security footage. He's smiling, he seems relaxed, he's talking with two women who he had probably approached to ask about another bar, and at 1:57 a.m. he steps back inside the bar, and then nothing. That is the final confirmed moment of Brian Shaffer's life. So, when the bar closes at 2 in the morning, crowds spill out onto the escalators. Clint and Meredith wait outside, texting him, calling him, but Brian doesn't respond. At first, they assume he's gone home or gotten a ride or simply slipped out unnoticed, but he didn't. Because here is the most terrifying fact in this case, the detail that turns it from a tragedy into an enigma. No camera ever captures Brian leaving the bar. Not by the escalator, not by the stairs, not by the service exits, not through the back, not through the construction zone. There's nothing, no footage. There's no timestamp. There's no silhouette, no shadow. Brian Shaffer enters the Ugly Tuna Saloon, a bar with only one public entrance and exit, and is never seen leaving. He simply ceases to exist on camera. Now, this is not the 1970s. This is 2006. This is a modern building on a modern campus covered in surveillance. So how does a grown man vanish from inside a bar? This is the moment where this case leaves the realm of misadventure and enters something stranger. Did he slip into a service corridor? Was he taken? Did he fall into a construction shaft? Did someone help him leave unseen? Or did something else happen? Nobody knows. So when Brian doesn't show up for his Miami flight with Alexis that Monday morning, everything collapses at once. She calls him. There's no answer. She calls again. Goes straight to voicemail. She waits at the airport gate with his father, Randy, and Brian never arrives. This is when Alexis realizes something is very wrong, because Brian wasn't just missing a flight. He was missing their future, their plans, their escape from grief. And Brian wasn't the kind of man who ran from the people he loved. When Alexis later recalls that morning, she says she felt an immediate, primal dread. The kind that doesn't fade, the kind that sits in your stomach and waits. That morning is when Brian's disappearance became more than a concern. It becomes a crisis. Police are notified, posters go up, friends start calling hospitals, and family calls media outlets. Everyone is asking the same question. How does a man vanish from a bar with cameras at every exit? Now, this is where the case deepens, because the answer to that question may not be simple, and it may not be innocent. When the Columbus Police Department takes the case, they expect a straightforward disappearance. A man gets drunk, wanders off, gets lost, maybe gets hurt. That happens on college campuses more often than anyone wants to admit. But within the first 48 hours, detectives realize something is different. You see, the Ugly Tuna Saloon sits on the second floor of a complex called the Gateway, which in 2006 was still partly under construction. The only public way in or out was the escalator that led directly to the bar entrance. And the escalator is monitored by a high-resolution security camera. So the police start there. They review the footage over and over, frame by frame. They see Brian walk in. They never see him walk out. They see dozens of other people leave the bar, couples, groups, strangers, friends. They identify every single one of them, but none of them are Brian. He doesn't appear disguised. He doesn't appear ducking behind someone. He doesn't appear walking away during a camera glitch. He just doesn't appear at all. Now, every theory investigators try hits the same wall. There was no way out without being seen. Well, unless he left through a non-public route. So detectives start mapping every possible exit: maintenance doors, service hallways, loading docks, emergency stairwells. construction chutes, elevator shafts. They bring in building engineers, fire marshals, security staff. Every single one gives the same conclusion. There's no normal exit that explains this, but there was one disturbing possibility. So in 2006, the Gateway complex was still under heavy construction. There were areas of unfinished flooring, holes in the concrete, exposed pipes, and critically, a service freight area behind the bar that was usually locked, but not always. Now, if Brian wandered back there intoxicated or disoriented, he could have fallen. Construction workers later told investigators there were vertical drops, maintenance shafts, and open conduit that led deep down into the infrastructure of the building. And that's where theories begin to form. So the first theory is the unseen exit theory. This is where Brian slipped through a service door behind the bar unnoticed by cameras. There's the construction drop theory, where Brian fell into a shaft or chute still open that night. It would have been a fatal flaw where his body became wedged, hidden, or sealed behind later renovations. But this causes a serious problem because police searched everything, and I mean everything. They searched the basement, the tunnels, the elevator shaft, the maintenance corridors, the ductwork, the crawl spaces. They used cadaver dogs. They used infrared. They used thermal imaging, search teams with rope harnesses, and nothing. Not a trace, not a shoe, not a piece of clothing, not a smell. Almost 20 years later, construction workers who renovated the space say no body was ever found, no bones, no remains. So if Brian fell, where did he go? And how can a body disappear in a building that never stopped being used? You see, that's the problem with the theories that depend on an accident. Accidents leave evidence, and Brian, he left none. Okay, so to understand what happened, detectives turned to the people who were with Brian that night, his friend Clint Florence and his other friend Meredith Reed. They also spoke to the two women that he spoke with on camera. They spoke to the bartenders, the security staff, and a few things stood out immediately. The first is that Brian and Clint were separated inside the bar. So friends later said that they had been drifting apart. Others said that Brian seemed distracted, quieter than usual, but Meredith was the one who picked him up after the bar hopping earlier. She later passes multiple polygraph tests and cooperates fully with police. She was cleared. However, Clint refused a polygraph. This becomes one of the most controversial parts of the case. Clint's lawyer told him not to take one, and Clint insisted that he had nothing to hide. Detectives insisted that he was not as cooperative as they had hoped, but here's the details that amplify the suspicion. Clint was the last friend to see Brian inside the bar. According to him, they got separated after Brian took a phone call. Clint left shortly before close, assuming Brian had gone home, but investigators were never fully satisfied with his account, and Clint never reached out to Brian's family during the search, not even once. What's even more unsettling, in the years following the disappearance, Clint moved out of Ohio and cut off contact with nearly everyone connected to the case. Is that guilt? Trauma? Privacy? Coincidence? There's no proof he did anything wrong, but in the vacuum of clues, silence grows suspicious. Now, if there's a heart to this story, a raw, wounded core, it is Alexis Wagner, Brian's girlfriend. She and Brian were supposed to fly to Miami 2 days after his disappearance. Their bags were packed. She thought he might propose on that trip, and she called Brian's phone constantly. Weeks later, something chilling happened. One night, his phone rang 3 times. Not voicemail, not a glitch. A real ring. She screamed, and she answered. There was nothing but silence. Phone records later showed the call pinged from a tower in Hilliard, Ohio. But the phone company said it was almost certainly caused by a signal bounce, not a real call. Still, Alexis remembered the sound, the possibility, the hope, and the rawness. Years later, she said, I believe Brian would never leave me, so whatever happened, it wasn't by his choice. Now, that belief does carry weight because people in pain sometimes do disappear. But people in love rarely vanish without a goodbye. Within days, Brian's disappearance becomes a statewide mystery. Police drain nearby ponds, they search 50 abandoned buildings, they sweep the sewer system, they look through dumpsters, go through alleys and storm drains. They distribute tens of thousands of flyers. And Ohio State students organize volunteer brigades. The FBI even gets involved. Every lead goes nowhere. Then the search widens. They search hospitals, rehab centers, shelters, airports, bus stations, and still nothing. The case is then officially classified as missing and endangered, but over time that label begins to feel insufficient. Because Brian didn't just disappear. He vanished in a way that seems engineered, planned, or orchestrated. And one theory begins to echo louder than the others. What if Brian didn't walk out because he couldn't? What if someone else knew the ways out, ways that weren't on camera? What if someone helped Brian Shaffer leave the building or prevented him from ever leaving at all? Now that's where theories start to reshape. Because if Brian was meant to vanish, then someone else was part of the disappearing act. But who and why? Years after Brian disappeared, something strange happened. A comment appeared online claiming Brian was still alive. It used a name, a location, and a date. Investigators traced it, but it was nothing. It was just a cruel prank. But in 2020, another image surfaced online, a homeless man in Tijuana, Mexico, who resembled Brian. Police compared facial structures. They ruled it out. But the digital era keeps pulling Brian's name into new shadows. Ghost sightings, false leads, scam psychics, amateur sleuth theories, but nothing ever breaks through the noise. There's no new footage, no new witnesses, no new physical evidence. Brian Shaffer remains exactly where he vanished, which is nowhere. Every unsolved disappearance eventually becomes a hall of mirrors. Facts are warped. Rumors solidify into memories, and people fill the empty spaces with what feels most plausible or most terrifying. Brian's case is no different. Over nearly 2 decades, 4 main theories have emerged. Each one has passionate supporters, vocal detractors, and missing puzzle pieces that prevent it from becoming the answer. Tonight, we're going to walk through all 4. It's not sensationalized, not dramatized, just carefully, honestly, and with respect for the man at the center of it. So the first theory is that he walked away on purpose. This is the theory police initially considered, but then slowly abandoned. The idea is simple. Brian, overwhelmed by grief from losing his mother, buckled under the pressure of medical school and chose to run. He left everything behind, his phone, his car, his wallet, his girlfriend, his father, and started a new life. Some missing people do this, some vanish willingly, but here's the problem. Brian didn't prepare in any way. He didn't withdraw money, didn't talk about wanting to leave, didn't leave a note, didn't show signs of suicidal intent, and didn't display any planning behavior. His passport remained untouched, and his accounts never moved. His social security number was never used again, and that's the biggest issue. He would have had to walk out unseen, in a building filled with cameras, through exits only employees knew about, and without help. Psychologists who studied the case agree that Brian may have been grieving, but he wasn't unraveling. Walking away from your life is an act of intention, and Brian's last recorded moments, he was smiling, chatting, making plans, and showed no signs of intention. This theory for many is the weakest, but it remains a possibility. That leads us to the second theory, which is an accident in the dark. So, some people believe that Brian found an unmonitored construction space inside the gateway and slipped through a door, fell into a shaft, and died. Now, it's possible. The complex was chaotic in 2006 with open pits and unfinished structures. But again, there is a problem. The building was thoroughly searched, not just once, multiple times, and by professionals. Nothing was found. No remains discovered during later renovations. There was no bones, no clothing, not a trace. So, could a body become trapped somewhere unreachable? Technically, yes. But the odds are microscopic. The accident theory is comforting because it doesn't require malice, but it collapses under scrutiny. So that leads us to theory number 3, that someone helped him leave. Now we enter more complex territory. For Brian to leave unseen, someone with knowledge of the building's blind spots must have assisted him, intentionally or otherwise. Now, that someone is usually assumed to be a few different people. It could be a staff member, a construction worker, or someone Brian met inside the bar. Now, there is zero evidence for this, but it remains possible, and police interviewed staff, they interviewed security, contractors, they interviewed the musicians, the night workers, the regular staff, and nothing. No one saw him. No one escorted him, no cab driver saw him, and no passerby saw him. So if someone helped Brian disappear, they took that truth to the grave or are still walking around with the weight of that night. This leads us to theory number 4, which is foul play. This is the theory that investigators have publicly stated they consider most likely. So that night was rowdy, it was crowded, it was very loud, and definitely alcohol fueled. And Brian was vulnerable. He was separated from his friends, and the complex had construction zones, dark corners, and locked rooms, spaces few people could understand. He could have been attacked, and he could have gotten into an altercation. He also could have been led somewhere, or pushed, or trapped, or hidden. But here's the core problem. There is no crime scene. There is no evidence. There's no blood, no disposal site, no witnesses, no noise. Again, there is nothing. Now, usually murder leaves fingerprints on reality, but here there's nothing. Which brings us to the most controversial part of the case. Some believe the last person to see Brian alive knows more than they've said. And that brings us directly to the Clint Florence problem. This part must be handled carefully and fairly, and I'm going to present facts, not accusations. So the first fact is Clint was one of Brian's closest friends. He was with Brian the entire night, up until moments before he vanished. Clint left the area that morning for his spring break trip and didn't join the search when they returned. Clint refused a polygraph test, and his lawyer told him not to take it. Now, Brian's father, Randy, publicly stated that he found Clint's behavior to be troubling. And the next fact is that Clint eventually moved out of Ohio and stopped communicating with nearly everyone involved in the case. Now, none of that is proof of anything. Lawyers advise clients to avoid polygraphs all the time. People disappear from friendships without meaning harm. But Clint's silence has become the gravity center of the case. Everyone around him pulls into suspicion. In 2014, private investigator Don Corbett said, "I believe that Clint knows more than he has said." Brian's own family echoed that sentiment. But without evidence, the theory ends in fog. Clint has never been charged, never been named a suspect, never been officially implicated. But no matter how far Clint moves, the shadow of that night does follow him. If anyone deserves to be the emotional center of this episode, it is Randy Shaffer, Brian's father. Randy was devastated by the loss of his wife in 2006, and then 1 month later, his son vanished. 2 gut punches in 30 days. He searched relentlessly, handed out flyers in blistering heat and freezing rain, walked alleyways, riverbanks, and fields, begged police for updates, and begged strangers for information. He aged years in a matter of months, and in 2008, Randy himself was killed in a tragic accident. A tree fell on him while he was working in his yard. The pain of losing Brian outlived the man most desperate to find him, and shortly after Randy's death, someone posted a cruel message online pretending to be Brian, pretending that he was alive. Now, investigators did trace the IP address, and the prank came from a young man in Franklin County. But the damage was done. Randy died without answers, without knowing what happened to his son, without any closure. And today, a memorial bench sits beside the tree that fell. People leave flowers and notes, messages for a man who carried a weight no parent should carry. And the world moves on, but the questions still remain. The internet has taken Brian's case and spun it into dozens of fringe theories. Some are insulting, some are absurd, some are even frightening. But there are some worth examining, if only to rule them out. So there is the hospital tunnels theory. Rumors that there are underground utility tunnels connected to Ohio State Medical Center, which allowed Brian to escape or hide. But none connect to the Ugly Tuna or the Gateway. There's the homeless disguise theory, the idea that Brian abandoned his life to live anonymously among Columbus's homelessness. Reality is that hundreds of homeless men were checked and interviewed and there was no match. There's the drug cartel theory. which claims Brian saw something he shouldn't have inside the bar. The reality, there's no evidence of this. Police deny any credible connection whatsoever. There's the body hidden in the walls theory. This is a pervasive belief that Brian's body was sealed behind drywall or concrete during construction. The reality is that there's been multiple renovations over 17 years and no remains have ever been found. Now there's the human trafficking theory. Some believe that Brian was lured and taken for trafficking. The reality is that trafficking cases almost never begin with adult men in crowded bars, and so this theory has no evidence either. There's the stairwell abduction theory, which claims that Brian went into a restricted stairwell and encountered someone dangerous. The reality? It's possible, but again, there's no evidence. You see, the internet feeds on mystery, and Brian's case is a feast. But the truth remains stubborn. None of these theories explain how Brian left the bar unseen, unless he never did. There is one possibility that traumatizes everyone who studies this case. It is rarely said out loud, not because it's sensational, but because it's horrifying. But here it is. Brian may never have left the ugly tuna alive. He may have died inside the bar in a restricted area during a fight, an accident, or something darker, and his body may have been removed before morning through a corridor the public didn't know existed, where there were no cameras, where there were no witnesses, and it would leave no evidence. The construction zone was chaotic, storage rooms unlocked, back hallways rarely monitored, and there were deliveries at odd hours, trash hauled away in large containers. If Brian died, either accidentally or otherwise, and someone panicked, the environment was perfect for a cover-up. It was messy, it's dark, it's unfinished, and it was a labyrinth. A body could be removed, disposed of, hidden, dumped, destroyed, all without ever touching the main entrance. Is it a grim theory? Yes. Is it possible? Absolutely. Is it proven? Not at all. But it is the theory investigators privately consider the most plausible. Because when you remove all other explanations, what remains is often the truth. And yet, the case still defies certainty. Brian's disappearance is not just unsolved. It is confusing. It's contradictory. It's impossible in a way that should not be possible. A man goes into a bar with cameras, a bar with people, a bar with staff, a bar with construction workers, and he never comes out. Not onto the street, not into the tunnels, not to another city, not anywhere. It is a magic trick with no magician, a vanish with no illusion, a question with no answer. So why does Brian's case linger so deeply in the public mind? Because it taps into something primal. The fear of losing track of someone in plain sight. Surveillance is supposed to protect us, to explain the unexplainable, to prevent exactly this kind of thing. But in Brian's case, surveillance becomes the villain, the failure, the lie. Because cameras don't guarantee truth. They can only guarantee what they saw, not what they missed. Now, urban disappearances are rare. They're very rare. But when they do happen, they strike a nerve because if Brian could vanish, so could anyone. From any city, any bar, any busy street, any ordinary Friday night. You see, Brian becomes a symbol of the places we cannot see. The blind spots in our systems, the moments no camera catches, the dark spaces between frames. He becomes the fear that even in a world of constant surveillance, we can still lose each other. Time does something strange to unsolved cases. It doesn't heal them, but rather fossilizes them. Brian's disappearance hardened into a kind of cultural relic. Every few years, a new article reopens the wound. A podcast episode revisits the timeline. A photo circulates online and fuels comparison. A rumor spreads that a homeless man in another state looks just like him. A forum thread claims a new witness has come forward, but nothing ever breaks the case. Nothing ever reveals where he went. Nothing ever becomes the missing puzzle piece, and instead, the mystery takes on a second life. Not as a hunt for a man, but as a symbol of something larger. The limits of surveillance, the fragility of our routines, the loneliness hidden in crowds, the idea that someone can slip between the cracks of a system built to track everything. That is part of why Brian's story won't fade. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's unnerving. It reminds us that even in a world of cameras, signals, data, and digital footprints, a person can still disappear without explanation. A horrifying thought, and a humbling one. A reminder that control, safety, and certainty are illusions. Comforting ones, but illusions all the same. In the years after Brian vanished, his brother Derek often spoke about the quiet moments, the birthdays missed, the empty chairs, the unasked questions. Derek said, "We didn't just lose Brian, we lost the version of ourselves that existed when he was here." Their father Randy carried that same heartbreak. He kept Brian's apartment clean and untouched, as if his son might walk through the door again. He left the porch light on every night for years, and he once said, "I just want to bring my boy home, no matter what that means." When Randy died in 2008, his obituary included a heartbreaking reminder that his eldest son was still missing. Some say Randy's death closed the emotional chapter of the case, but that's not entirely true, because the people who love Brian, Alexis, Derek, friends from OSU, carry the weight forward. They carry the hope, they carry the grief, they carry the unanswered questions. They carry the silence left behind by a man who was too bright, too kind, too alive to simply vanish. The real tragedy is not just that Brian disappeared, it's that the world kept going around without him, as if he had never been there at all. Most unsolved disappearances from 2006 fade from memory. Brian's does not. Why? Because Brian vanished at a cultural turning point, the moments just before smartphones, just before social media, just before ubiquitous cameras, and just before digital tracking became normal. He disappeared in the last breath of the analog world. If Brian had gone missing just 5 or 6 years later, the timeline would look different. There would be more cameras, more phone pings, more metadata, more GPS, more digital exhaust. But in 2006, all Brian leaves behind is a final moment captured on a grainy footage, like an eerie last photograph. It is the clip, more than anything else, that keeps him alive in the online world. People watch it over and over, trying to read his body language, trying to decode his smile, trying to see something the police missed. His last moment becomes a digital ghost, looping forever, frozen in time, innocent, unaware, walking toward an ending he didn't know was coming. Some people photograph sunsets, some photograph weddings, some photograph their pets. The last picture the world has of Brian is a surveillance freeze frame. A man laughing seconds before he vanishes. A moment that feels like premonition, only because we know what comes next. In 2023, Columbus police released an updated age progression image of Brian, showing what he would look like now, in his mid-40s. They haven't closed the case, they haven't forgotten him, and he's still listed as missing and endangered. And he's a possible victim of foul play. But there's something else, something rarely said aloud. Privately, investigators acknowledge the cases like Brian's don't end with reunion. They end with recovery, or they don't end at all. Nobody in law enforcement believes Brian walked away from his life. Nobody believes he's alive today. What they do believe and what they can't prove is that something happened inside that bar. Maybe around the bar, and it was in a moment the cameras didn't catch. They just don't know what, or why, or who. Every anniversary, they receive new tips, new theories, new claims. Most lead nowhere, but a few do deserve investigation. None of them have brought Brian home. The vanishing point remains exactly that, a point where the line of his life simply stops. Why does this story cling to us so tightly? Why does it haunt people who never knew Brian? Because Brian's disappearance isn't just frightening, it's offensive. It offends our sense of order, our sense of justice, and our belief that the world is understandable if we just pay attention. Brian's case says the opposite. You can do everything right, be loved, be successful, be responsible, be surrounded by people, and still you can vanish. It's the fear that the universe might contain holes, places where people simply fall through. Brian's disappearance lives in that fear. It's not just that we need answers, it's that we want them. We want to reassure ourselves that reality is not porous and that we are safe inside it. But Brian's story whispers something else. Safety is a story we tell ourselves, but the truth is always stranger and far more fragile. Let's return to the moment the world last saw Brian. He's smiling, laughing, his body language relaxed and open. The escalator behind him glowing with city lights, the night fresh and full of spring energy. He isn't afraid. He isn't suspicious. He isn't running away from anything. It's an ordinary moment in an ordinary bar on an ordinary Friday night. And then he steps inside and never returns. This is the part that lingers. Not that Brian disappeared, but that the disappearance looks like nothing at all. 1 minute he's there. The next minute he's not. No sign, no struggle, no warning, no trace. It is the purity of the mystery that makes it terrifying. Some cases are violent, some are accidental, some are premeditated, some involve strangers or family or lovers. Brian's case involves none of these things, and possibly all of them. He becomes a symbol of something larger. The unknown spaces of modern life, the dark corners beneath bright lights, the blind spots between cameras, the secrets that people carry, the fractures in our understanding of the world. Brian is not a ghost story. He is a reality story that feels like a ghost story because it defies the rules that we trust. And here's the truth I keep returning to. Someone, somewhere, knows what happened. Even if they told no one, even if they have forgotten, even if the memory has rotted with time, someone knows, or once did. Someone was there in the second before Brian vanished and the second after. This person could be a perpetrator, a witness, a worker, a friend, a stranger, someone. But until they speak or fate uncovers what time has hidden, Brian remains frozen inside that last moment, smiling and unaware. A man poised between a doorway and oblivion. When we close this story for tonight, I want you to hold on to something. Most mysteries end. This one hasn't, not because it can't, but because we don't yet understand the shape of the truth. Brian's disappearance is a reminder that the world is not neatly organized. People vanish, clues mislead, surveillance misses moments it shouldn't. And sometimes the dark is not hiding a monster, but hiding nothing at all. And maybe that's scarier. But somewhere between fear and closure, between theory and truth, between reality and the blind spots just outside the camera frame, there is Brian, a man who existed, a man who mattered and who is missed, and who deserves an ending the world has not yet given him. If you're listening tonight from Columbus or anyone anywhere near the truth, and you know something, anything, no matter how small, speak. Because stories like this don't resolve themselves. People resolve them. And until that day comes, I'm Mr. Bones, and this is the Night Tales Show. Thank you for walking with me through this darkness. And remember, sometimes the scariest stories aren't the ones with monsters. They're the ones with empty spaces, where a person should be. Have a good night.